Pizza time. You should be able to make incredibly delicious pizza at home without needing a pizza stone. I'll show you how to make a really simple 4-ingredient pizza dough that's versatile enough to work in a cast iron or in a sheet tray. It's crazy versatile, so you've got options. You can make one that's fluffier, crunchier, and a little bit darker, or you can make something that's thinner, crispier, and still just as delicious. Also, if you stick around long enough, I'll show you a secret third style that I've sort of been playing around with that comes out really nice and delicious. These absolutely crush any pizza cravings and are totally achievable for you at home. No pizza stone required. To start, we need to make our own multi-purpose dough. And if you haven't made your own dough before, it can feel really intimidating. But just remember that bread baking is a really old tradition for a reason. People have honed their skills over time, and just like artisans of the past, you'll get better at it the more you do it. This dough is gonna make around 2 to 3 pizzas depending on the size of your pans. And I really do recommend a kitchen scale for this. There's almost no other way to do it by cups. It's definitely worth having in the kitchen. It's a tool that I use pretty much every day. It gets used for our coffee beans, it gets used for measuring. It's just really helpful to know exactly how much of an ingredient you're getting, and there's almost no replacement for it. Honestly, they're super cheap. You can get them for like 15 bucks on Amazon. I'll link to the one that I use every day. If you're gonna get into baking at all, I don't want you to have to buy a ton of special equipment. A scale, however, is something that is almost a non-negotiable. It's like having a stove for cooking. Like, it really is that important. Measure out 350 grams of hot tap water, around 115 Fahrenheit or so, and put it in your mixing container, the one that you're gonna be using the whole time. In a separate small bowl, measure out 0.5 grams of active dry yeast and just pull a splash of that water and put it in. Add 500 grams of all-purpose flour into the water and mix it together with your hands. This is a dough specifically not made for a mixer, so you don't have to go out and buy a stand mixer. This can be done by hand. Makes it pretty simple for you. We're not gonna be doing an insane amount of kneading, and we're gonna let time do the work for us. Once your flour and water are combined, let it rest covered for 30 minutes so the dough can autolyze. This basically allows us to skip the kneading process as the gluten structure begins to form as the water hydrates the flour. After those 30 minutes are up, pour in your yeast and water mixture and then sprinkle on 10 grams of sea salt. Mix this together completely with a wet hand and really give this a chance to come together. The salt needs a little bit of time to fully dissolve into the dough and spread throughout, and this is your chance to really mix the whole thing together. A good technique is stretching and folding the dough over itself a couple times. This mixes in the salt, and it also provides structure to the network of gluten that we're building. Let that sit covered for 30 minutes, and then we're gonna perform the same stretch and fold. Another 30 minutes, and another stretch and fold. Once you've done your 2 stretches and folds, put a touch of olive oil in the container so it comes out easier later. Honestly, I forgot to do this because it's like 1 in the morning when I was making this. You'll see what happens later because of that. You lose a lot of the air because the dough itself sticks to the walls of the container. Let that sit in the container on the counter covered for around 10 to 12 hours. I know this sounds like a lot of work, but the timing itself works out so that you can make the dough on maybe a Saturday morning or a Saturday night. That way you can have pizza on Sunday night or Monday as well if you make enough. After that 12 hours and the dough has at least doubled in size, you can take it out of the container and separate it into 3 equal-sized balls. One of the benefits of this dough is it's a really hydrated dough. There's a lot of water in it. Usually when a dough itself has more water in it, you get a better flavor and a better texture, but it's harder to work with. The fact that we're not kneading this dough a ton means that we don't have to have it really easy to work with. It can be wetter, and that's gonna lead us to a much more flavorful and delicious final dough. Take it out of the container, set it on your floured surface, and cut it into 3 equal-sized balls. These are gonna be roughly 275 grams each. These little sections can be folded over themselves to make small balls, and then you're gonna roll it against the board to form like a taut ball. Simply cup your hand over the dough ball and keep the palm of your hand touching the floured surface you're working on and kind of roll it along almost like you're moving a mouse in a circle. The surface tension that we're building here allows air to stay inside the dough while it rests in the fridge. Set these on a sheet tray, cover them in plastic wrap, and let them sit in the fridge for at least 6 hours. A really good timeline for this is starting in the morning on Saturday or on like a Saturday night. That way you can get the 12-hour bulk ferment out of the way and get the dough into the fridge. It's only gonna get better with time, up to a certain point, of course. You can't leave this in the fridge for like a week, but that time window allows the dough to ferment, get a little bit tastier, and you get a little bit better of a texture from it. Quick note about the flours for this pizza. You can absolutely use all-purpose flour and get a really good result. At the grocery store one day, I found some of this 00 pizza flour, and in my readings, everybody recommends using that, but I wanted to give you something that was easy to replicate However, this flour really is just a straight up upgrade in flavor and texture versus all-purpose. All-purpose isn't bad by any means. By the time I started filming, it was late enough in the day and I didn't have enough of the standard all-purpose flour that I had been using. I ended up just using this 00 flour. It's delicious. It's absolutely worth getting if you plan on making pizzas. It does just give you a straight up upgrade in flavor and texture to all-purpose. Again, absolutely worth making if you just got all-purpose. This isn't me trying to flex on you or show off in any way. It really is just what I actually had lying around. So that's in the fridge resting. We can take our time now. Any good pizza needs a sauce to stand up to the delicious dough, and I've recently landed on a sauce that I absolutely adore. Sometimes you get pizza sauce that just tastes too tomato pasty. Honestly, if you've ever eaten a Lunchables pizza and you put too much of that like cold, squeezy tomato sauce on one of them, you know just how bad pizza sauce can be, and this is not what we want to do with this. Take a can of high quality tomatoes and blend them with a stick blender. You don't really have to take them out of the can, just stick your stick blender right in there. The sauce is gonna slightly thicken, so I want this to be entirely smooth right now. Get that into a saute pan over medium heat and season it with 2 grated cloves of garlic, a 1/4 teaspoon of chili flake, 3/4 of a teaspoon of salt, and 1/4 teaspoon of dried Italian herbs. Add in a large sprig of basil and a good glug of a really nice tasting olive oil and let this come up to a simmer and then drop the heat. Let it cook for about 20 minutes on medium low and then turn the heat off and let the basil steep for another 10 minutes. The fact that we're doing this in a saute pan allows it to cook a lot faster and allows some of the water to evaporate, leaving us with a thicker, more textured sauce without it having to have a ton of chunks in it. Remove your basil and you'll have a perfectly seasoned, but still bright tomato sauce that's perfect for our pies. Yeah, good girl. Hey, Lana. Yeah. Everyone knows mozzarella is the cheese of choice for pizza, and this is just some low moisture whole milk mozzarella from the deli. I like to cube this into a small dice, that way it's gonna melt slower on top of the pizza in the oven. The slower the cheese melts, the less likely you are to end up with a greasy pizza. When it's under the heat too long, the cheese itself squeezes the protein and the fat kind of leaches out, and you get that kind of oil slick on top of your pie. That's why you see like a greasy yellowy layer. That's not from the pepperoni, that's actually from the cheese. After your dough has rested in the fridge for a sufficient amount of time, let's say 6 hours, let's say 2 days, it's time to decide what kind of vibe you're aiming for with your pizza. I'm gonna start with the deep, crunchy cast iron version. This almost turns out like a pan pizza, something really, really nice and crispy on the bottom. It's almost fried in the olive oil that we're gonna put on the pan. Place your oven at 525 degrees Fahrenheit and let it get nice and hot while you prep the dough. Make sure your rack is near the bottom of the oven. That's gonna give us that nice, crunchy crust because a lot of the heat comes from the bottom of the oven. What we can do here is place a little bit of olive oil into the pan itself. Take your dough off the tray from the fridge and spread it out slightly in your hands above the board and above the pan. Then just place it in the pan and use your fingertips to spread it out. Oil itself is gonna make the spreading a little bit more challenging because it's gonna wanna kind of slide back together, but it's okay. As long as it reaches the edges of the pan, you're gonna be perfect. Top the dough with sauce. Really, this is a preference thing. I don't like too much. I like to see a little bit of the dough here, but just know because it's thicker and because it's cooked in a pan, it can stand up to a little bit more sauce than like a thin crust pizza that you have to slide off a pizza peel. I find that on the pizzas I make, usually about 4 ounces of cheese is right, but who honestly is measuring the cheese on the pizza? It's not me, so just top it from the heart. What I like to do is place a piece around pretty much every edge of the pizza. That way it's gonna melt into a crunchy, dark cheese crust, almost like a Detroit style. I'm not gonna call it that, but you get a similar result. I'm still a diehard pepperoni fan. No topping can beat it, maybe pineapple in my book, but I'm not gonna get into that here. I know that's a pretty contentious take. I like a lot of pepperoni on my pizza and maybe some sliced chilies if I want some extra heat. These are just the best tasting sliced pepperoni I can find, and some Serranos and Fresnos thinly sliced. With that, this can go on the lower rack of our 525 degree Fahrenheit oven for around 20 minutes or so. The dough needs time to fully cook, so keep that in mind here. Let it get nice, beautiful, dark, crunchy. I think I tend to like my pizzas a little bit cooked more than other people do, so cook it to your liking. I was the kid who would like overdo my frozen pizzas for sure. After around the 18-minute mark, check on how the cheese is browning and the quality of the edge. If your edge is really nice and set, but your cheese is looking a little bit pale, you can run it under the broiler, but mine was done at about 21 minutes or so. Take it out of the oven, and to get the cheese released from the edge, I like to just run a spatula along the side and slide it out onto a wire rack to cool for like a minute or two. For this pie, I like some red pepper flakes, some dried Italian herbs, and I also like to tear some basil on at the end. This is gonna sound stupid, ridiculous, and probably not good to a lot of people, but this reminds me of like the best frozen pizza. It's fluffy, it's crunchy, it's really, really tasty. It's cheesier than a lot of the pizzas you can make at home because it's got the sort of structure from the pan itself, and it just comes out so satisfyingly hearty. It reminds me of when in high school I was really cool and would skip the Friday night football games and instead make a frozen DiGiorno pizza and learn how to hip hop dance via YouTube videos. Those were much simpler times, that's for sure. Man, I really could throw down. One day I'll have to tell you guys about how I broke my leg dancing. That's a good story for sure. For our second pizza, set the oven to 525 degrees Fahrenheit again, and grab a sheet tray. Oil up the tray so we can get an almost crispy fried texture to the bottom. Take the dough directly from the fridge and spread it out on your oiled sheet tray. No real stretching skills here, simply try to keep as much air in the dough as you possibly can. If it isn't spreading, let the dough rest for like 15 minutes to kind of relax, and it should spread out a little bit more. Once the dough is about edge to edge, top it with a little bit of sauce, definitely less sauce than you put on the pan one, and I like a combination of that same whole milk, low moisture mozzarella, but with a ton of pecorino on top of the sauce. Grate your pecorino on first and then hit it with those mozzarella cubes. This can get a sprinkle of Italian herbs before going in the oven, and let it rip for around 11 minutes on the low rack. This time is pretty much a perfect cook for the bottom while not overdoing the cheese. This comes out as somewhere of a cross between a grandma pie, a sheet pan pizza, and honestly, if you squint hard enough and cut it the right way, this can get you something that's sort of like a slice of pizza. I'm not gonna name any cities involved with regular slices of pizza, but it can definitely hold its shape if you cut it into a slice and no one's gonna know a difference. It's crispy, it's light, it's really, really tasty, and if you use the combination of cheeses, it's got a lot more flavor than you think it's going to from just like a regular mozzarella. It needs less time in the oven, so it works better if you're prone to accidentally setting off your smoke alarm. It's not the same type of dry, sort of floured crunch. You don't get that same leoparding you get in like a real New York style pizza. This isn't that by any means, but it's sort of got that same level of thin crispiness that you want in a pizza like that. The secret pizza I promised you is something I cooked up while trying to get a really, really nice margarita pizza at home. If you've ever had like a Neapolitan pizza, you know how important it is to get a really, really hot oven to cook the dough without getting a ton of like crunch on the bottom. You have to cut it with a knife and fork because it's kind of soggy in the middle, and there's a desired texture in that. The way that I make this cooks the toppings at a way higher temperature, so we can get away with using fancy fresh mozzarella. Cut your fresh mozzarella into cubes just like the other pizzas, but I like a little bit bigger of a dice here. Set it in the fridge while we handle the dough. Just like the second pie, this is gonna go on a greased sheet tray, but I actually like to spread this out on a floured work surface first. What that means is you can get it really, really nice and thin before it gets onto the oil and starts to like pull back on itself. It's a little bit hard because the dough is so wet to move it from the board to the actual sheet tray. So what I'll often do is set the tray down next to it, oil the tray, work the dough out on the board, and then make sure there's enough flour for you to sort of slide the dough directly onto the tray. It's not perfect. I'm not a very skilled pizza maker. I just know how to make something that ends up really, really tasty. Turn the oven on 525 degrees Fahrenheit and make sure there's one rack on the bottom and there's one rack really close to the top broiler element. Make sure it's covered and just let it sit at room temperature for an hour. Halfway through that hour, turn the oven on 525 degrees Fahrenheit and make sure there's one rack on the bottom and there's one rack really close to the top broiler element. We're gonna be doing a double cook on this pizza, and that's really what sets this apart. The first one is just gonna be the dough on the bottom rack for about 7 minutes. This is gonna cook it almost all the way through, so the bottom is set and the dough itself has already cooked, but the toppings themselves haven't seen any heat yet. Apply a thin layer of sauce and then our fresh mozzarella cubes. For a margarita pizza like this, I do like some fresh tomatoes on it to go along with the sauce that we've got cooked. So simply dice some really, really good tasting tomatoes. Think like cherry or grape. Whatever season you're in, those usually end up tasting really, really nice. I also like to tear on a bunch of basil here. You'll notice I didn't do basil on the other pies. They simply sit in the oven for too long and the basil ends up kind of black, shriveled, and flavorless. Hit the top with some flaky salt if you're bad, and then turn the oven onto a high broil and place that pie on the top rack. We're gonna let this cook for about 3 minutes, but it's the broiler, so you're gonna have to keep a close eye on it. We're gonna let the dough on the edges get a little bit of char. We're gonna let the tomatoes kind of char and burst, and the cheese itself is gonna take on some really, really nice color. You're gonna do this all while not letting it burn. Once you've seen that everything is browned to your liking, you can take the pizza out and immediately slide it onto a rack to cool for a second. This is one that I think benefits from a ton of fresh olive oil at the end. It's completely different, I know, and this is absolutely blasphemous to say, but this gives you an end result that kind of tastes like a Neapolitan pizza. I know it's ridiculous to say. I know there are strict rules on what makes a Neapolitan pizza, and this is not that. I'm not saying this is a exact copy of it. What I am saying though is this is something that's fresh with a really, really nice creamy and chewy mozzarella. It's got that same desirable watery sog. Honestly, after having made these pizzas a ton of times in my testing, this one ended up being a sleeper favorite of mine. And these are our pizzas. We've got one dark, fluffy, crunchy, perfect pan pizza. Oh, beautiful. One that's thinner, almost more like a grandma pizza. And lastly, we've got one that surprises in its simplicity, in its brightness, in its flavors. You get to use the freshest ingredients possible to create that charred edge with that Neapolitan style sog that so many people desire. These are all delicious and these are all absolutely worth making. Let me know in the comments down below which one you think your favorite would be, or if you've ever made any of these styles before, how they turned out for you. If you make it and you end up taking a photo of it, tag me on Instagram. I love it when people do that. I always end up sharing it because it just really, really blows my mind that people make the food that I cook. Thank you so, so much for watching, and thank you to the amazing people supporting me on Patreon. There are people who support me directly financially through patreon.com/CameronMarty, and it just means the world to me. You're gonna see their names flying by on screen right now, and just a massive shout out to them. If you had enough of pizza and you need something a little bit healthier, a little bit lighter for a weeknight meal, check out the kava bowls that I made last week. They are delightfully bright, delightfully tangy, a little spicy, and perfect for your Thursday night dinners. Thanks again for watching. Cheers.